Welcome to Foundational You with Dr. Dean Hackett, the home of biblical teaching and cultural impact. We are so glad that you joined us for today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Dean, read his blog, and find more episodes at fdeanhackett.com. Now for today's episode.
Welcome to Foundational You. I'm Dr. Dean. I'm really glad you have joined me in this podcast, our first podcast of 2023. And we're launching a new series entitled The Outcome of Moral Relativity. You know, the current American culture has been built upon the foundation of postmodernism philosophy. Postmodernism philosophy says there are no absolute values, and they consider it naivete to think that there is objective reality. And so in postmodern philosophy, there is no truth. On the heels of postmodernism came, in the 1960s, the philosophy of Jacques Derrida called deconstructionism. Now, the tenets of deconstructionism is that truth and reality are fluid. They're fluid. There is no absolute truth. There is no absolute reality. In other words, what may be true to this person is not necessarily true to that person. And what may be just and fair to those people may not be just and fair to these people. In other words, postmodern deconstruction culture, everyone is doing that which is determined to be true, just, fair, and reality in their own reasoning and in their own ideology. There are no absolute standards in postmodern deconstruction culture. But that's the most devastating thing that has happened to this generation of American citizens. This generation of those that have been educated and trained in our schools for the last 30 years, 40 years. They have been taught this postmodern deconstructionist ideology and philosophy. And what that has done is that has caused each and every one to truly believe that what may be true for them doesn't have to be true for you. What's true for you doesn't have to be true for me. That I get to make up my own truth. I get to make up my own standard of what is just and fair. I get to develop my own moral standards. And what that has done is deconstructionism has literally crushed everything that is good, everything that has value, everything that has a sense of decency and goodness to it has been crushed to the ground, because everything has been replaced with this standard of moral relativity, that everything is fluid. And so what I may have believed was true 5 years ago doesn't necessarily I don't have to believe it's true today. What may have been just and fair in that circumstance may not be just and fair in this circumstance, because everything is fluid. And so what is morally right here may not be morally right over here. And so I can believe something is morally right and good in this situation, but not necessarily morally right and good in this situation, because there is no absolute standard. Everything is fluid and free-flowing. Everything is fluid and free-flowing. And what that has done then, the joy of being unique, the joy of being gifted, the joy of of believing that you have a future and a purpose and a destiny. A person's identity and sense of worth and value is being cast to the ground and is being crushed by a culture that says that there is no absolute reality, and we are the art of debate, the art of challenge is being lost in our culture through deconstructionism that is canceling out the joy of debate, the challenge of saying, prove to me that is absolutely true. Prove to me that, well, there is no absolute truth. There is no absolute reality. It's all fluid. And so those that believe there are some absolute standards, there are some absolute right and wrong, there are some absolute truths that life is to be lived by, when they raise their voice and they call for that, deconstructionism is canceling them. They're canceled from the social media. They're canceled from being in the media. They're canceled from being a professor at a university. They lose their position in the medical field, in the science field, because there is no place for challenge or debate, because deconstructionism removes that. So an entire culture is left at risk. But this is not the first time that we have seen this happen in history. We can go back to the 13th century BC, the time recorded in the book of Judges, and listen to what it says. In chapter 17 and verse 6, it says, "In those days there was no king. In Israel, everyone did that which was right in his eyes." In fact, the book of Judges closes in chapter 21 and verse 25. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That's how the book of Judges closes. Everyone is doing that which is right in their own eyes. Well, how did that work out for them? Well, the first thing that we discover is that Israel rejected Almighty God, who had been their God and the God that they had worshiped from the time they had been delivered from Egyptian slavery, the Almighty God that took them across the Red Sea on dry ground and then destroyed the Egyptian army by flooding them when they tried to cross on dry ground. The Almighty God that gave them water from a rock so that 1.5 million people were drinking from that river of water that God gave them in the desert. The Almighty God that gave them food every day from heaven. Almighty God that gave them victory over every enemy when they didn't even have a standing army and didn't have engines of war, and yet Almighty God gave them victory over every army. The Almighty God that took them across the Jordan River at flood time on dry ground. The Almighty God that gave them victory over every army that came against them, and so they were able to take possession of the land of promise. The Almighty God that gave them a supernatural victory at Jericho. That God they rejected, and they began to accept pagan gods. And so the first thing that we see in the culture of Israel in the 13th century BC, when everyone was doing that which was right in their own eyes, is their culture had become secular, pagan, and hypersexualized. Because in doing that which was right in their own eyes, everyone had their own moral standards. And the culture became highly sexualized because they began worshiping gods that had temple prostitutes. Their gods said that great sex was a part of their worship, and when if they had great sex with temple prostitutes, they would be able to have fertility in their cattle and their crops would be fertile. They began to adopt that highly sexualized culture that led to homosexuality and transgender. We find that their culture had weak leadership that vacillated. There would be times that a good leader would rise and there would kind of begin to advance and move forward. But because the root of that culture, that everyone did that which was right in their own eyes, they would go back to that. They would go back to that time and again. Family relationships were weakened. Crime and violence rapidly increased. Terrorism was being dealt with every day, so that in many times ranchers and farmers would be taking care of their harvests in secret, because terrorists would come and steal their cattle and steal their harvest. We're watching in this culture that historically in the 13th century BC, when everyone was doing that which was right in their own eyes, there was no stability, there was no anchor point, and people did not live in safety and in freedom, because everyone was doing that which was right in their own eyes. And so their women weren't safe on the streets, their children weren't safe on the playgrounds, because everyone was doing that which was right in their own eyes. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like American culture today? The culture of America that had been founded in a Judeo-Christian philosophy and ideology with moral standards, that for the first 200 years of our nation was solid and anchored in that culture. But as we have moved postmodern, we have thrown God out. We took Bible reading out of school. We took prayer out of school. We took the Ten Commandments out of public arenas. We've rejected Almighty God, and in place of that, we've brought in pagan gods. And so now we are a secular, pagan, and hypersexualized culture, because the gods we began to worship were the same gods that Israel worshipped in the 13th century. The gods of Asherah and Astarte, the gods of Baal and Moloch. And so we have, like they offered their children in worship to Moloch and would put their children to the fire, we have put our preborn children to the fire through abortion. We have taken the lives of 65 million of our babies in worship of Moloch. We're presenting our sons and our daughters into a hypersexualized culture in the worship of Astarte and Asherah, so that we're believing that what really makes you successful is when you have great sex. And what is happening is we're watching our culture move transgender. We're losing reality because moral relativity has taken over. We've watched crime and violence increase rapidly, and until now, it's not safe to be in the streets of cities like Chicago and Memphis and Baltimore, because there are dozens of shootings every weekend. We're watching as terrorism is afflicting our culture. And so there's shootings at our schools, there's shootings at our churches, there's shootings at our malls. The instability of our leadership, vacillating, can't make a decision, can't decide, and everything is the reason is because truth is fluid, reality is fluid. There are no absolutes. Everything is fluid and flowing. And so what was maybe a right decision 2 years ago may not be a right decision today. What was true yesterday may not be true today. What's true in this situation may not be true in this situation. Everything is fluid. And so our culture has this, the foundation is constantly moving. It's not a solid, secure foundation because it's constantly moving with that level of instability. What is the outcome of moral relativity? Well, we're going to see as we continue in this study, looking at what is the natural outcome of moral relativity and how can we get back to that? What will reestablish security and stability into our culture? How do we restore that? We're going to be looking at those questions as we continue in this series on the outcome of moral relativity. I'm glad you've joined me in this study today. I invite you to join me next week as we continue this study. We're going to look at what happens when the foundation of a culture becomes fluid, as we were just talking about. God bless you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for joining us today. This Christ-centered biblical training is a ministry of Spirit Life Ministries. We hope that you are blessed by this podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. For more information or questions for Dr. Dean, please contact us at the website fdeanhackett.com.